The area we now call Paris has been inhabited by humans for around 10,000 years. In the Stone Age, nomadic tribes settled in this region because of its rich soil, flowing river, and abundant wildlife. The Seine River was more than just a water source, it was a lifeline. It allowed early communities to fish, farm, and trade. But the story of Paris truly begins around 250 to 225 BCE, when a Celtic tribe known as the Parisii settled along the banks of the Seine. These Gauls were part of a larger group of Celtic peoples who lived across what is now France. The Parisii built a small settlement, which they called Lutetia, meaning the swampy place. They chose an island in the river, now known as Île de la Cité, as their base. It was easy to defend and close to major trade routes, linking the north of Europe to the Mediterranean. They built wooden bridges across the river and fortifications to protect their town. Over time, Lutetia became prosperous. So prosperous, in fact, that the Parisii began minting their own gold coins. That wealth, though, came with a price. It caught the attention of the Roman Republic. In the mid-1st century BCE, the Roman Empire, led by Julius Caesar, began its conquest of Gaul. The Parisii and other Gallic tribes resisted fiercely. In 52 BCE, Roman forces marched on Lutetia. A major battle took place, known as the Battle of Lutetia, and the Parisii were defeated. After the victory, the Romans established their own town on the site. They called it Lutetia Parisiorum, or Lutetia of the Parisii. This marked the beginning of Roman Paris. The Romans built their city in typical Roman style. They set up their town on the left bank of the Seine and laid it out along a grid. At the center was the Forum, which included temples, a basilica, and public baths. Nearby, they constructed an amphitheater, the Arène de Lutèce, which could seat up to 15,000 spectators, nearly twice the town's population at the time. During the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, Lutetia grew slowly but steadily. It was a peaceful Roman town, though it never became as important as larger cities like Lyon. Still, it was a comfortable place, with roads, aqueducts, and even heated floors in some houses. A turning point came in the middle of the 3rd century. According to tradition, this is when Saint Denis, a Christian missionary, arrived in the area. At that time, the Roman Empire still followed pagan beliefs and often persecuted Christians. Denis openly preached the Christian faith. He was arrested by Roman authorities and, after refusing to abandon his beliefs, was beheaded on a hill just north of the city. According to legend, Denis picked up his own head and walked several miles before collapsing. The place where he died became known as Montmartre, which means Mount of the Martyr. A church was later built there. Today, it's the famous Basilica of Saint-Denis. Christianity continued to spread through the Roman Empire, and over time, it took root in Lutetia as well. In the late 3rd century, the Roman Empire was facing growing threats from outside. Barbarian tribes began attacking towns across Gaul. Lutetia was not spared. To escape these raids, many residents left the left bank and moved to the relative safety of the Île de la Cité, the island in the middle of the Seine. They abandoned many of the old Roman buildings and used their stones to build a protective wall around the island. This was the first defensive wall of Paris, and it marks the beginning of the city as we know it today, a fortress on a river island. Around this same time, the name Lutetia began to disappear. From about 305 CE, Roman milestones started referring to the city as Civitas Parisiorum, or City of the Parisii. Within a century, it was simply known as Paris. By the 5th century, the Roman Empire was crumbling. waves of invasions swept across Europe. The Huns, led by Attila, and other barbarian groups threatened the land. One woman stood out during this dark time. Saint Geneviève, a local Christian woman who helped rally the people of Paris. When news spread that Attila and the Huns were approaching in 451 CE, she urged the city not to flee. Her courage inspired the citizens to pray and prepare, and miraculously, Attila changed his course and did not attack Paris. Geneviève became a hero and was later named the patron saint of Paris. But the end of Roman rule was inevitable. In 486 CE, a Germanic tribe called the Franks, led by their king Clovis I, defeated the last Roman governor in Gaul. The Franks took control of northern France, and with that, Paris came under their rule. Clovis was the first king of what would become modern France. He converted to Christianity, uniting many of the Frankish tribes under one religion and one leader. Paris became a royal city during his reign, gaining importance as the symbolic heart of the Frankish kingdom. Though Paris had now entered a new era under the Franks, it remained a modest city. The grand Roman monuments began to crumble. The amphitheater fell silent. The baths grew cold, and many of the old temples were repurposed as churches. But even as the Roman world faded, Paris held on to some of its past. The layout of the old Roman roads remained. Some stones from Roman times can still be found in the city's oldest churches. In many ways, the fall of Rome didn't destroy Paris. It gave it a new identity. It became a place of faith and survival. The Franks would lay the foundation for what would become the Kingdom of France, and Paris would slowly, over centuries, grow into its beating heart. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the late 5th century, Paris found itself in a time of great uncertainty. The Roman world that had once brought roads, baths, and a stable government had crumbled. What remained were scattered communities and aging walls, surrounded by threats from both outside invaders and internal chaos. But Paris would not disappear. In fact, it was about to take its first steps toward becoming the capital of a new power in Europe, the Kingdom of the Franks. By the end of the 5th century, Paris had come under the control of the Franks, a Germanic tribe that had been slowly gaining influence in northern Gaul. Their leader was a young and ambitious warrior named Clovis I. Clovis wasn't just any king. He would go on to become one of the most important rulers in early medieval Europe. Around 508 AD, he made Paris his capital. It was a symbolic choice. Though still small and modest compared to other ancient cities, Paris had a long history, solid defenses on the Ile de la Cité, and a central position in the growing Frankish realm. But Clovis didn't just bring political change, he brought religion. In a dramatic and historic move, he converted to Christianity, specifically Roman Catholicism, after winning a crucial battle. This decision gave him the support of the powerful church, setting the stage for centuries of Christian rule in France. During these early medieval years, the city's survival was also credited to a remarkable woman, Saint Geneviève. She had lived during the time of the Huns, a terrifying force that ravaged much of Europe. But according to tradition, she rallied the people of Paris with prayer and faith, keeping them calm during the threat of invasion. When the danger passed, she was seen as a protector of the city, and her memory lived on. She later became the patron saint of Paris. Over time, Clovis's descendants, known as the Merovingians, lost their grip on power. Real control passed to a new family, the Carolingians. In 751, Pepin the Short took the throne with the blessing of the Pope. His son Charlemagne would go on to become one of the most famous rulers in history. But Paris was not the center of Charlemagne's empire. He ruled from Aachen, far to the east. During the Carolingian dynasty, Paris became more of a regional town than a true capital. Still, it retained some prestige. It remained important for trade, religion, and defense. That defense was put to the test in the 9th century, when new threats arrived, this time from the sea. The Vikings, fierce warriors and expert sailors from Scandinavia, began raiding towns and cities along the rivers of Europe. Paris, located on the Seine, was a prime target. In 845, the Vikings launched their first major assault on Paris. They sailed up the river with a fleet of longships, pillaging the city and demanding a ransom. The Frankish king paid it, 6,000 pounds of silver. But that only encouraged more attacks. In 885, the Vikings returned with an even larger force. This time, the Parisians resisted. They fortified the Ile de la Cité, using the old Roman walls and whatever resources they had to withstand the siege. For nearly a year, they held out. Eventually, the Vikings gave up and withdrew. The defense of Paris was seen as heroic, and the man who led it, Count Odo, would later become King of West Francia. In 987, a major turning point came. Hugh Capet, a local nobleman and the Count of Paris, was chosen as king. He founded the Capetian dynasty, which would rule France for centuries. From this moment on, Paris would slowly grow into the political and cultural heart of the kingdom. At first, the Capetian kings controlled only the area around Paris. Much of France was still ruled by powerful feudal lords, but over time, their power expanded. As the monarchy grew stronger, so did Paris. During the early Middle Ages, Paris was still a relatively small city centered on the Ile de la Cité. This island was the heart of the city, home to churches, markets, and royal buildings. But slowly, neighborhoods on the left and right banks of the Seine began to grow. The left bank became known for its religious institutions. Abbeys like Saint-Germain-des-Prés and Sainte-Geneviève were built there, forming a network of monastic communities. These places were centers of learning, copying books and teaching theology. The right bank, on the other hand, became more commercial. Merchants, traders, and artisans set up workshops and markets. Ports along the river brought in goods, and the city began to buzz with economic activity. One of the most important developments in medieval Paris was the rise of education. Around 1150, the University of Paris was founded. It began as a group of cathedral schools, but soon grew into one of the most prestigious learning centers in Europe. Students and scholars came from all over to study philosophy, law, medicine, and theology. Latin was the language of instruction, and the debates held in its lecture halls helped shape the intellectual life of the continent. This made Paris not just a political and commercial city, but also a scholarly one. The left bank, especially the Latin Quarter, became filled with booksellers, libraries, and schools. By the late 12th century, Paris had grown rapidly. Under King Philip II, also known as Philip Augustus, the city underwent a major transformation. He built a massive stone wall around the city to protect it from outside threats. This wall enclosed both banks of the Seine and gave Paris a clear boundary. Philip also paved the muddy streets, built a central market at Les Halles, and established the Louvre, originally a fortress to defend against invasions. Philip II also supported the university, expanded royal authority, and made Paris a more organized and modern city. His reign marked the beginning of Paris as the true capital of France. At the heart of this growing city stood an ambitious new building project, a grand cathedral on the Ile de la Cité. Construction began in 1163, under Bishop Maurice de Sully. The cathedral was called Notre-Dame, meaning Our Lady, in honor of the Virgin Mary. Notre-Dame took nearly 200 years to complete. It was a marvel of Gothic architecture, with its tall towers, flying buttresses, and magnificent stained glass. It became the religious center of Paris and one of the most famous churches in the world. Inside its walls, kings were crowned, mass was celebrated, and the people of Paris gathered for worship and ceremony. It stood as a symbol of the city's faith, power, and pride. In the 13th century, Paris reached new heights under King Louis IX, later known as Saint Louis. He was a deeply religious king who promoted justice, charity, and peace. One of his greatest contributions to Paris was the Sainte-Chapelle, a royal chapel built between 1241 and 1248. It was designed to house holy relics, including the crown of thorns. The chapel's stained glass windows are among the finest examples of Gothic art in the world. Louis IX also reformed the legal system and established a reputation as a wise and fair ruler. His reign further strengthened the position of Paris as a center of government, faith, and culture. Despite its growth and splendor, medieval Paris was still a city of sharp contrasts. At its peak in the early 14th century, it was the largest city in Europe, with nearly 200,000 people. But life for most Parisians remained hard. Narrow streets were often filthy, crowded, and poorly lit. The air was filled with smoke from chimneys and the smell of open sewers. Disease was common, and the gap between rich and poor was stark. At the bottom of society were peasants, beggars, and laborers who struggled to survive. Above them were skilled craftsmen, organized into guilds that regulated their trades. Then came the merchants and bankers, whose wealth helped fuel the city's expansion. The clergy held special status, often working in education or administration. And at the top were the nobles, many of whom lived in fine houses and served the royal court. Still, despite its challenges, Paris was becoming a true medieval metropolis, alive with trade, culture, and ideas. By the beginning of the 14th century, Paris stood as one of the most important cities in the world. It had grown from a Roman outpost into a religious, political, and intellectual powerhouse. Its churches and cathedrals reached toward the sky, its markets bustled with goods, and its streets echoed with the voices of students, priests, merchants, and kings. But new challenges lay ahead. In the coming centuries, Paris would face war, disease, and revolution. Yet through it all, the city would continue to adapt, evolve, and survive. It had already endured centuries of transformation, and its story was far from over. By the early 14th century, Paris had firmly established itself as a major urban center. The city thrived with commerce, scholarship, and religious life. But the days of medieval stability were numbered. Soon, Paris would face a series of seismic events: war, plague, religious conflict, royal ambition, that would shape its destiny and transform it into the model of a modern European capital. King Charles V, who reigned from 1364 to 1380, responded to fears of invasion by ordering the construction of a new and more extensive wall. Between 1356 and 1383, Paris was enclosed behind stone fortifications that wrapped around both banks of the Seine, far beyond the old medieval limit. This wall included towers, gates, and had enough space for more sprawling neighborhoods. A record 200,000 people now lived within its precincts. The wall signaled Paris's place at the heart of the Kingdom of France, but it also foreshadowed the troubles to come. Even as the city expanded, a dark tide was rising across Europe. Between 1347 and 1351, Europe was ravaged by one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, the Black Death. Paris was hit hard. Up to 50,000 people died in 1348 alone, about a quarter of the population. The plague returned periodically for centuries, but that first wave was the worst. With so many deaths, labor became scarce. Work was in demand, but wages remained low. The social structure pulled at the seams. Peasants struggled to get by. Tradesmen found themselves in precarious economic positions, and food shortages were frequent. The city's wealthier residents retreated behind closed doors, and fear hung thick in the air. Meanwhile, a long and bitter war was underway between England and France, the 100 Years' War. It began in 1337 and would stretch all the way to 1453, with intermittent battles and political upheavals. Paris found itself on the front lines when English King Henry V invaded northern France in 1415 and scored a decisive victory at Agincourt. 2 years later, in 1417, his forces marched into Paris. In May 1420, Henry V was crowned King of France inside Notre-Dame Cathedral, though the legitimacy of this title was limited to English-controlled parts of the country. The occupation lasted until 1436. In 1429, the unlikely hero Joan of Arc emerged, lifting the siege of Orléans and guiding Charles VII to Reims for his coronation. This began the French counter-offensive. By 1436, Paris was back under French control, but the city had suffered economically and psychologically from years of war and English authority. The end of the 100 Years' War ushered in a new era. Paris began its transformation from a fortified medieval city into a Renaissance cultural capital, particularly during the reign of King Francis I, 1515 to 1547. Francis had a passion for art, learning, and architecture. He invited Italian artists like Leonardo da Vinci to his court. He commissioned the first version of what would become the Louvre Palace, initially a grand residence rather than the fortress it once was. He also ordered the expansion of the city hall, Hôtel de Ville, and encouraged the construction of bridges and fountains. Under his guidance, Paris built schools, printing presses, and cultural institutions. A new faculty at the University of Paris, established in 1531, focused on Greek, Hebrew, and mathematics. By the late 16th century, around 75 printing presses operated in Paris, more than in any other European city. Books and ideas flowed freely through the city, helping spark the intellectual rebirth of the Renaissance. But this era of growth coincided with religious strife. The Protestant Reformation, begun by Martin Luther in Germany, spread across Europe. In France, its followers were known as Huguenots, Protestants who rejected the authority of the Catholic Church. The decade from 1562 to 1598 marked the French Wars of Religion. Within Paris, a devoutly Catholic city, tensions ran high. It became a stronghold against Protestant influences, making it a focal point of conflict. On August 23, 1572, the wedding of Margaret of Valois and the Protestant Henry of Navarre, later Henry IV, was intended to show unity. Instead, just days later, the massacre began. Known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, Catholic mobs hunted down Huguenots across Paris and France. Historians now estimate that around 3,000 Protestants died in Paris alone, and many thousands more perished elsewhere. The violence sent shockwaves across Europe and left deep scars in French society. It would take decades for the wounds to heal. The wars ended finally when Henry of Navarre accepted the Catholic faith in 1593 to become King of France as Henry IV. His famous words, "Paris is well worth a mass," symbolized his pragmatic turn. As king, Henry IV sought to restore and modernize his divided kingdom. He issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598, granting religious freedom to Protestants and ending most civil strife. More importantly, he turned his attention to Paris. Henry rebuilt and beautified his capital. He began constructing the Place des Vosges, Paris's first planned square with uniform facades. He commissioned the Pont Neuf, completed in 1607, the first Parisian bridge to span both banks of the Seine. He ordered renovation of the Louvre, Hôtel de Ville, and the Tuileries Palace. Paris was once again a city of hope and ambition. After Henry IV's assassination in 1610, his widow, Marie de Medici, ruled as Queen Regent. In 1615, she built the Luxembourg Palace and founded formal institutions of governance, including academies focused on painting and sculpture. Her son, Louis XIII, reigned during the era of Cardinal Richelieu, his chief minister. Together, they continued centralizing royal power. They commissioned grand buildings and encouraged the arts. Paris began to take on a unified aesthetic. In 1643, Louis XIII died, leaving his young son, Louis XIV, the Sun King, on the throne. His reign marked the apex of royal absolutism. But Louis XIV distrusted Paris. After the uprising of the Front Nobles, 1648 to 1653, he moved his court to Versailles. Though he left the capital, Paris continued to flourish. The old walls came down, making way for wide boulevards lined with trees. Cafes, salons, theaters, and cafes sprouted across the city. Paris became known for its elegance and style, both in architecture and social life. In 1789, under King Louis XVI, Paris was bulging with inequality. Farmers and workers suffered under crushing taxes, while nobles and clergy lived in luxury. Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Rousseau had challenged traditional authority. Now the anger reached a breaking point. In May, the Estates General met at Versailles. Tensions erupted, and in June, the Third Estate proclaimed itself the National Assembly. On July 14th, Parisians stormed the Bastille, the medieval fortress symbolizing royal power. Its fall marked the symbolic beginning of the Revolution. A cry heard throughout Europe. Paris became the political center. The National Assembly abolished feudalism, declared rights, and wrote a constitution. Yet radical forces soon took over. The Reign of Terror, 1793 to 94, led by Robespierre, executed thousands, including the king and queen, by guillotine. Streets were governed by revolutionary committees, and paranoia reigned. By 1799, exhaustion and violence opened the path for a strongman, Napoleon Bonaparte. He seized power, ending the revolution and beginning the consulate. As first consul and later emperor, Napoleon sought to crown Paris as the jewel of his empire. He promoted order, merit, and grandeur, blending Enlightenment ideals with imperial pomp. In December 1804, he crowned himself emperor at Notre-Dame, a spectacle watched by cheering crowds. He reformed the legal system with the Napoleonic Code, modernized administration, and improved infrastructure. Architecturally, Napoleon reshaped the city. He commissioned triumphal monuments like the Arc de Triomphe, completed around 1836, modeled after Rome's arches. He built new bridges over the Seine and widened roads for military and civilian use. The Louvre was enlarged and the city was reimagined through a lens of imperial pride. But ambition had its price. Endless wars across Europe eventually led to his downfall. In 1815, after defeat at Waterloo, he was exiled. Allied forces briefly occupied Paris, and the Bourbon monarchy was restored. Though conservative, Bourbon kings struggled to govern. In 1830, Charles V provoked a backlash with repressive laws. Parisians erupted in barricades. After 3 days of fighting, the king fled. The July monarchy installed Louis Philippe, the citizen king. Under him, Paris grew as a bourgeois capital. Railroads arrived, new industries emerged, and the population surged. But inequality persisted. In 1848, another wave of Republican revolution swept across Europe. Paris was once again barricaded and fired upon. Louis Philippe abdicated, and the Second Republic was declared. The new republic was short-lived. In 1851, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, Napoleon III's nephew, seized power, soon becoming Emperor Napoleon III. His rule brought dramatic transformation to Paris. He appointed Baron Georges Eugène Haussmann as prefect to modernize the city. Between 1853 and 1870, Haussmann tore down medieval neighborhoods and built wide, tree-lined boulevards, grand squares, and uniform apartment buildings with elegant facades. He extended sewer systems, installed gas lighting, and created parks like the Bois de Boulogne and Bois de Vincennes. Napoleon III dreamed of a modern imperial capital. He hosted universal exhibitions, showcasing France's progress. The Seine banks were pedestrianized, bridges rebuilt, and rail stations constructed. Paris became a city of beauty, order, and light. In 1870, the Franco-Prussian War shattered imperial dreams. Napoleon III was defeated at Sedan, and Paris was besieged. Food shortages led to desperate times. Residents ate rats, zoo animals, and worse. In January 1871, the city surrendered. Soon after, the Paris Commune rose, a radical socialist government governing Paris for 2 months. Government forces brutally crushed it in May, leaving thousands dead and the city scarred. The Third Republic endured. The scars of the Commune were slowly repaired, both physically and psychologically. Haussmann's boulevards remained, but the city carried lessons of revolution and repression. From the 1870s to World War I, Paris entered a golden age. Known as the Belle Époque, the city shone with innovation, culture, and optimism. Paris hosted 5 expositions universelles, notably in 1889 when the Eiffel Tower was unveiled. An initial symbol of modern engineering, it was meant to be temporary, but it became permanent. Its metal lattice now the icon of the city. The arts flourished. The Impressionists, Monet, Renoir, Degas, exhibited new visions of light and life. Writers like Hemingway, Joyce, Proust settled in, preparing their words in cafes. Jazz arrived with African-American musicians, especially in Le Marais district, weaving rhythm into Parisian nights. At the same time, poverty and inequality endured. Pint-sized workers and immigrants lived in crowded arrondissements. Political tension simmered with anarchists and reformers. When World War I began in 1914, Paris was threatened by German advances. During the First Battle of the Marne in September 1914, Parisian taxi drivers famously transported 6,000 soldiers to the front in just one night, a moment immortalized as the Taxi of the Marne. Though spared direct siege, the city endured Zeppelin raids and long-range artillery fire. After the war ended in 1918, Paris emerged both triumphant and exhausted. The Union Sacrée and victory parades masked a society burdened by loss. The 1920s in Paris were electric. The Left Bank cafe scene thrived. Le Dôme, Les Deux Magots, Café de Flore, filled with writers, painters, and thinkers. Politics and art mingled. Modernism, surrealism, feminism, and communism all found their place. But the 1930s brought crisis, economic depression, political violence, the growth of fascist and communist movements. Refugees from Germany and Spain arrived. Paris felt the tension as Europe hurtled toward another war. In May 1940, German tanks rolled into France. By June, Paris surrendered without a fight. The city became the seat of German administration. Cafes and cinemas served occupying officers. A yellow star marked the city's dues. Deportations began. One estimate says over 12,000 Jews were rounded up in Paris alone. Yet resistance quietly grew. Networks of Parisians, including students, workers, priests, and soldiers, used secret presses, sabotage, and intelligence to undermine the occupiers. On August 25, 1944, Allied forces and the French resistance liberated Paris. Charles de Gaulle marched down the Champs-Élysées, taking control. The city erupted in celebration. Tricolor flags, military parades, and tears of relief. With peace returned, Paris entered a period of reconstruction. Small parts of the city were rebuilt, monuments cleaned, infrastructure upgraded. A new wave of immigrants, especially from North and Central Africa, enriched the city's cultural mosaic. Paris regained its global status. Fashion houses, film festivals, and cafes bounced back. The Rive Gauche still buzzed with art. The suburbs, the banlieues, began to grow rapidly, blending modern housing with new social challenges. By the 1980s, Paris was once again the world's fashion and culture capital. François Mitterrand commissioned visionary public works, the Grand Louvre project with IMP's Pyramid, the Opéra Bastille, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Yet beneath the grandeur lay issues: urban sprawl, high rents, and social inequality. The 2000s saw tensions rise in the banlieues, highlighted by riots in 2005 that demanded greater attention to economic and racial disparities. Today, Paris stands as a dynamic global city, home to over 2 million people in its administrative area and up to 12 million in its metropolitan region. It leads in culture, finance, education, and diplomacy, hosting UNESCO, OECD, and major international conferences.